we have been going through the Gospel of Luke verse by verse. We started way over 2 years ago now, and we've reached chapter 21, where there is a very famous passage which is known as the Olivet Discourse. The reason it's called that is because it's a discussion that Jesus has with his disciples upon the Mount of Olives, hence the Olivet Discourse. You have Jerusalem, and then as soon as you leave Jerusalem, there's a small valley, and then there's Mount of Olives right across it. So if you're on the Mount of Olives, you can kind of look into the city of Jerusalem. Now, apart from the book of Revelation, the Olivet Discourse is probably the most famous passage that has to do with eschatology. What is eschatology? It comes from the Greek word eschaton, which means something final, something at the end. So when we're talking about eschatology, we're talking about the study of the end times, the last days, the final things. For sure, this is the most famous passage concerning eschatology in the Gospels by the words of Jesus. Now, let me say something really quick. If someone has not been here before, we do not talk about eschatology all the time. We're talking about eschatology because it's in our text before us today. We go verse by verse, and wherever the scripture takes us, that's what we talk about. There are some people, some Christians, who put way too much emphasis on eschatology, so much that I really think it's unhealthy. I mean, there are people who are completely imbalanced in their theology, where they may not be able to explain to you the Trinity, they may not be able to show you the deity of Christ, but man, I know what the character of the Antichrist is. And it's like, really? And so we need to have a balanced view of Scripture. Now, I understand that eschatology is fascinating, is very interesting, but let me say this. Amongst evangelicals, there is no greater field of disagreement than on the field of eschatology. There are people who are giants of the faith, amazing theologians who hold vastly different views concerning eschatology. So, let me warn you, right now, my position, at least on this passage, not on all of eschatology necessarily, but my position on the passage that we're going to read in Luke chapter 21 is a minority position. A lot of people interpret it very differently from the way I'm going to interpret it today, but I hope that you would follow along, and if you do not agree, at least deal with the arguments that I'm going to present. Now, first of all, let's read the passage. It's a long passage. It's a very long passage. So here's what we're going to do. Let me tell you real quick what we're going to do. What we usually do is we go through the passage verse by verse. Read a verse, explain it. Read a verse, explain it. Read a verse, explain it. That's not what we're going to do today. Today is going to be an introduction to the Olivet Discourse. Today I just want to see what's the big picture. What is Jesus talking about here? What's the big idea so that we understand what's going on, and then in the coming 2 or 3 weeks we'll come back and go through it verse by verse and look at all the details in it. But first we need to know what he is talking about. And so you may see that in today's lesson there may not be so much application to our lives as I would like to present usually when I preach. It's just that we need to deal with some difficulties in this passage, and then coming next week it'll be a normal sermon again. So I'm going to read the entire passage so we have it in mind. Luke 21, starting in verse 5, and it goes all the way to the end of the chapter. Luke 21, verse 5. Then, as some spoke of the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and donations, he said, "These things which you see, The days will come in which not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down." So they asked him, saying, "Teacher, but when will these things be? And what sign will there be when these things are about to take place?" And he said, "Take heed that you not be deceived. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and the time is drawn near. Therefore do not go after them. But when you hear of wars and commotions, do not be terrified, for these things must come to pass first, but the end will not come immediately." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be great earthquakes in various places, and famines and pestilences, and there will be fearful sights and great signs from heaven. But before all these things they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons. You will be brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake, but it will turn out for you as an occasion for testimony. Therefore settle it in your hearts not to meditate beforehand on what you will answer. For I will give you a mouth and wisdom which all your adversaries will not be able to contradict or resist. You will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake. But not a hair of your head shall be lost. By your patience possess your souls. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter her. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe to those who are pregnant, and to those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress in the land, and wrath upon this people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword, and be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles, until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And there will be signs in the sun and the moon and in the stars, and on the earth distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them from fear, and the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth. For the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now when these things begin to happen, look up and lift up your heads, because your redemption draws near." Then he spoke to them a parable. "Look at the fig tree and all the trees. When they are already budding, you see and know for yourselves that summer is now near. So you also, when you see these things happening, know that the kingdom of God is near. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. But take heed to yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, and cares of this life, and that day come on you unexpectedly. For it will come as a snare on all those who dwell on the face of the whole earth. Watch therefore and pray always, that you may be counted worthy to escape all these things that will come to pass, and to stand before the Son of Man." And in the daytime he was teaching in the temple, but at night he went out and stayed on the mountain called Olivet. Then early in the morning all the people came to him in the temple to hear him. You can read the parallel passages in Mark chapter 13 and Matthew chapter 24. Matthew 24 is a much longer, believe it or not, much longer parallel passage where he gives far more information about the Olivet Discourse. Now, when most people read this passage, they say, okay, there's a lot of stuff going on here. So I'm not 100% sure, not exactly sure of everything that's going on, but I read about wars, and I read about earthquakes, and I read about famines, and I read about the coming of Christ in power and glory. So obviously, clearly, this is talking about the end of the world. Not only do they say, okay, this is about the end of the world, but they assume that everything in this passage is only about the end of the world. There's a big problem with that, though. Big problem. And that is the context. Context. Please remember, always, context. What is going on? Matthew and Mark tell us that Jesus, after having condemned the Pharisees that we saw last week, Jesus and his disciples leave Jerusalem and they go onto the Mount of Olives. And they're looking across and they're looking at the temple. And verse 5 that we saw says, "Then, as some spoke of the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and donations." Speaking of the disciples. The disciples are there with Jesus on the Mount of Olives. They're looking in Jerusalem and they see the temple. And they're like, wow, the temple is just brilliant. It's just amazing to look at. I mean, this thing had sheets of gold plastered on it. The sun would come up and it would just blind you. It was so bright. It was the most magnificent thing that they had ever seen. And so they say to Jesus, look at this temple. It's just amazing. And so Jesus replies in verse 6. And he says, "These things which you see," talking about the temple, "the days will come in which not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down." Now, Jesus has used this language many times before. Just in Luke alone, we read in Luke chapter 13 where he said, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who killed the prophets, your house," the temple, "your house is left desolate to you." In Luke 19, not too long ago, we saw Jesus saying, "For days will come upon you where your enemies will surround you and close you in on every side, and they're going to level you and your children to the ground." What's this a reference to? Reference to the destruction that was going to come upon the nation of Israel and Jerusalem and the temple in the year 70 AD, where the Romans came and leveled the place to the ground. That occurred in the year 70 AD, only a couple of decades after Jesus prophesied about it. And so this is how the discussion begins. Before we look at anything else, keep in mind that's the context. That's the context. It starts off with the discussion of the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 AD. Now that alone, what Jesus says here, is a radical statement. Rabbis didn't walk around in Jesus' time saying the temple is going to be destroyed. Just like in the days of Jeremiah, when Jeremiah would say, the temple is going to be destroyed by the Babylonians, people were like, you're crazy. We're the people of God. This is the temple of God. Our enemies are not going to destroy us. Well, Jesus seemed just as crazy when he said, no, the Romans are going to come and destroy everything. Just as in the past, in the 6th century BC, God was angry with Israel because they were turning away from God, and he sent the Babylonians. So now in the 1st century AD, he is more angry with Israel because they have rejected the Messiah. Now, and we know all the details historically, how in 70 AD the Romans came and they destroyed the city, they destroyed the walls, they destroyed the temple, killed probably over 1 million Jews, all according to Jesus' prophecies. Now, verse 7, the disciples ask a question, 2 questions actually. So they asked him saying, Teacher, but when will these things be? And what sign will there be when these things are about to take place? All right, Jesus has just talked about the temple being destroyed. And the disciples asked 2 questions. First question, when? When's it going to happen? That's the question. When is it going to happen? They don't ask why or how, what. They say, when is this going to happen? Second question, what will be the sign? What is it that is going to point us to the event? What are we going to see that will let us know that the destruction is about to happen? Those are the 2 questions. And Jesus goes on to answer them. Now, thankfully, most interpreters understand that the context begins, the passage begins with a discussion of the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. But what happens along the way, they say, okay, Jesus is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, but then at some point he kind of shifts and starts talking about the end of the world. That's how most people understand this. Now, we're not going to look at every verse. We're going to do that next week. In verse 8, he talks about false Christs that are going to come. Verses 9 to 11, he talks about wars and commotions and earthquakes and famines, things that are popularly called the signs of the times. We watch the news and we see earthquakes and wars, and people say, oh, that's signs of the times. That means that Jesus should be coming back sometime soon. Verses 12 to 19 speak of persecution and attacks that are going to come upon the disciples. And as you're thinking, okay, Jesus is about to talk about the end of the world now, in verse 20 he says this, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. And you say, oh, yeah, we were talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. We weren't talking about the end of the world, were we? When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Verse 21, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter her. Makes a lot of sense. Usually when the big army was coming against you, you would get into a city, bolt the doors, and hope to handle the siege. But Jesus says, when you see armies, don't go into the city, run to the hills, because the city is going to be destroyed. And Christians did do that in the year 70 AD and escaped and were not killed by the Roman armies. Verse 22, for these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. Yeah, because how are you going to run if you're pregnant or if you have a little baby? For there will be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people, and they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. 2,000 years later today, still where the temple used to stand, there is, what's there now? It's a Muslim mosque. The Mosque of Omar that stands there. Hasn't changed. Now, verse 25 says this, and there will be signs in the sun, and in the moon, and the stars, and on the earth distress of nations and perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them from fear and expectation of the things which are coming on the earth, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory, and so forth. Now, what's going on here? All of a sudden it seems that Jesus is talking about the end of the world. We were talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Now it seems that we're talking about the end of the world. All right. In verse 29, he starts talking about a parable. It's a very short parable. Verse 31, he says, so also when you see these things happening, know that the kingdom of God is near. Look at verse 32, please. Verse 32 says, assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all things take place. Now we've got a problem. Now we have a serious problem. And in case you don't see the serious problem, Jesus just said that all these things, the word these isn't in here in this verse, but it is in Matthew and Mark. Jesus states, all these things that he has just spoken will come upon this generation, he says. Now, we've got a serious problem here. And the problem is this. Jesus has spoken of signs in the sun and the moon and the stars and his coming in great power and glory, which seems to be speaking about the end of the world. But now he just said, these things are going to come upon this generation. What are we going to do with that? That generation, which was alive at that time, did not see the end of the world. And so this is our problem. What's the solution? In my mind, I can see three possible solutions. I need you to pay close attention now. Let's worship the Lord with our minds. Listen, there's three possible solutions to this. First solution, which has been presented by many people, Jesus was wrong. Jesus was wrong. Jesus prophesied that the end of the world would come upon his generation, and it didn't happen. Therefore, Jesus is wrong. And you may laugh and say, well, we know that that's not true. I can see people going, come on, Nico, I don't believe that. You know I don't believe that. But here's the problem. Do you know how many enemies of the faith use this text to teach that Christianity is not true and that Christ was wrong? Most of the time when atheists or people of other religions try and attack the Bible, they'll come and they give the most ridiculous, dumb arguments that can be refuted in a sense. Oh, yeah, I saw on the news last week that Jesus had a wife. And it's like, oh, for crying out loud. You know, most of the arguments that people bring are just idiotic most of the times. But not all enemies of the faith are dumb. Many of them are intelligent. And many of them have read this text. And they say, here, Jesus speaks of the end of the world, and he says it's going to come upon this generation. Didn't happen, therefore Jesus was wrong. What do you do with that? You've got to do something with it. So that's the first solution. Jesus was wrong. Okay, we're Christians. We don't believe that. What are the other two options? The other two options are these. Either the phrase, this generation, has to refer to something else other than the generation that was alive at the time of Christ. When Jesus says these things are going to come upon this generation, he doesn't mean the people who are alive at that time, but he's talking about something else. That's one option. Or, when Jesus talks about signs in the sun, the moon, the stars, and stuff like that, and his coming in great power and glory, he meant something else by that. He meant something else. Something has to give. If we're going to take both literally, at face value, then Jesus predicts the end of the world coming upon his generation and it didn't happen. So one of those two things has to be interpreted differently. Either when he talks about sun, moon, and stars and signs and his coming, we have to interpret that differently, or when he says that all these things are going to come upon this generation, we have to interpret that differently. That is the only option. So let's think about it. The phrase, this generation. Now, if the literal interpretation as you just read it, when someone says these things are going to come upon this generation, ordinarily you would think, okay, the people who are alive today, okay, not everyone may be alive to see it, but people who are alive today will see it. Now, how else could we look at this? Some people interpret this and they say, well, the word generation here, yener, is not referring to the people alive at that time, but it is referring to a kind or a type of people, a sort of people. And so when you read this generation will not pass away till all these things happen, they say, well, what that means is these kinds of people will not pass away till all these things happen. Well, what kinds of people? Some people say, well, this is a reference to the Jews. That Jesus is saying, the Jewish race shall not pass away till all these things come to pass. Some other people say, well, no, this is a reference to Christians. This generation is the Christian people. And so this means that Christians will not pass away till all these things come to pass. Other people just take it much more vaguely and say, it's just talking about the human race, that people will not cease to exist until the end of the world. Seems a bit of a stretch to me, but some other people say, no, what's going on here? Jesus is not talking about his generation. When he says this generation, he's not talking about his generation. He's talking about the generation at the end of the world that is going to see all these things. Now, why does Jesus then say this generation? He could say that generation, but he doesn't say that generation thousands of years from now. He says this generation. So, it's possible, but I find it I think it's quite stretching it for Jesus to say these things are going to come upon this generation to mean a generation thousands of years from now. Now, the problem with any of these arguments is that nowhere in the New Testament does the word yenah refer to some kind of race or type of people. It just doesn't. Maybe the word yenos can do that, but not the word yenah. In fact, here's the thing. Jesus uses the phrase, this generation, many times, a couple of dozen times. And every time he uses the phrase, this generation, he is clearly referring to his contemporaries, people who are alive at that time. Let me give you a couple of examples. We don't have to turn there because there's a bunch, but Matthew 11, he's speaking to the people who have just rejected John the Baptist, and now they're rejecting him, and he says, to what shall I liken this generation? It's like children who are not happy with anything. You're not happy with John, you're not happy with me. To what shall I liken this generation? He is clearly speaking about the people who are there listening to their preaching. And I don't know of any commentator in the world who would give some kind of different meaning to the phrase this generation in that context. Matthew 12:41, Jesus says, the men of Nineveh will rise in the judgment with this generation and condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and indeed a greater than Jonah is here. What's he talking about? Jonah had gone to the Ninevites centuries earlier, to an earlier generation, and now Jesus had come to the Jews, and that generation, which was alive then, was rejecting him. And he says, the men of Nineveh, an earlier generation, are going to rise on the day of judgment with this generation, clearly speaking about his contemporaries. One last one, Luke 17. Jesus is speaking about his return at the end of the age, and he says, but before that happens, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by this generation. Clearly speaking about his contemporaries. So, there are many references in the New Testament to the word generation, and there are many references to the phrase, this generation. And they all point the same direction. Now, it's possible that when Jesus says this generation, that maybe he's speaking of a type of person. Maybe he's speaking of a generation thousands of years later. But it is highly unlikely. All the evidence is overwhelming to the literal, normal understanding of this verse, where Jesus says, all these things are going to happen upon this generation. And so if we're going to change the meaning of the phrase, we have to have a serious reason to do so. Do we have a serious reason to change the meaning of the word this generation? And some people say, yes, we do have a serious reason to change it, because Jesus has just spoken about the end of the world. Signs and wonders and his coming, and that didn't happen in the first century. That didn't happen with his contemporaries. Therefore, yes, we got to change the meaning of the phrase this generation. But what if, this is just let me just throw this out there. What if, when Jesus speaks of signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars, and great disasters, what if he is not talking about the end of the world, but he is talking about the end of the Jewish world? What if Jesus, when he talks about his coming in power and glory, what if he is not talking about the end of the age where he will return to judge the world, but what if he's talking about his coming in judgment upon the Jewish nation? Now you will say, Nico, is there anything in the Bible that supports this idea? Is there anywhere else in the Bible where this kind of language is used for something other than the end of the world? Is anywhere else this language used talking about signs and wonders and the stars not giving their light? And be referring to something other than the end of the world? And the answer is yes. Let me read you a couple. In Isaiah chapter 13, there is a prophecy against Babylon, the destruction of Babylon, which came by the Medes and the Persians. And in this long prophecy of judgment upon Babylon, it says this: "For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be darkened in its going forth, and the moon will not cause its light to shine." Well, Babylon fell in the 6th century BC. Did the sun and the moon literally go out? No, it was a symbolic, poetic, metaphoric way of speaking of an amazing destruction that was going to come upon Babylon. Let me give you another one, Ezekiel 32. There's a prophecy of judgment upon Egypt. In Ezekiel 32, and he says, "I will also water the land with the flow of your blood, even to the mountains, and the riverbeds will be full of you. When I put out your light, I will cover the heavens and make its stars dark. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon shall not give her light. All the bright lights of the heavens I will make dark over you and bring darkness upon your land." This is a reference to the fall of Egypt by the Babylonians in the 6th century. Let me give you one final one. Isaiah 34 speaks of the destruction of Bozrah, which was the capital of the nation of Edom. And these words are used concerning the fall of Edom. "All the hosts of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled up as a scroll, and their hosts shall fall down as the leaf falls from the vine, and as fruit falling from the fig tree." Question: did these things happen? Did the sun, the moon, the stars fall from the sky and so forth when Edom fell, when Egypt fell, when Babylon fell? Yes, but not in literal terms. There were such great destructions. They utterly destroyed those nations. This is decreation language, speaking of great destructions that come upon cities and nations. And it seems that Jesus may be doing the same thing here, speaking about Jerusalem, because the fall of Jerusalem, trust me, is a greater fall than any of the other cities put together. Now, so here's my understanding. I know a lot of you are going to disagree with me. That's okay. We can discuss it. Here's my understanding. From the beginning of the Olivet Discourse till verse 32, when Jesus says all these things are going to come upon this generation, I believe this is a prophecy concerning the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD and the events leading up to it. Now, you may ask, Nico, so are you saying that there's nothing in the Olivet Discourse that talks about the end of the world? I didn't say that. Give me a moment. Notice we didn't finish the passage. We didn't finish the Olivet Discourse. We stopped at verse 32, but there's still like 4 or 5 verses left. And we're not going to go through each verse right now, but after that, Jesus says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. And then he goes on to basically tell us to always be prepared for the coming of Christ. And you say, okay, Nico, but what are we talking about now? Are we talking about the coming of Christ upon Jerusalem, or are we talking about the coming of Christ upon the earth at the end of the age? Well, remember that I told you that in Matthew, there are far more details about this. Here we only have like 5 verses after Jesus said these things are going to come upon this generation. But if you go, please go to Matthew 24. You will notice that Matthew gives us far more information. Far more information. Go to Matthew 24 and look at verse 34. It says, assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. So that's where we are in connection to Luke 21. That's where we finished off. Then he says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. Verse 36, but of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. Of what day and hour? Notice in the previous verse he's just mentioned heaven and earth passing away. That's interesting. Look at verse 37. But as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away, so also with the coming of the Son of Man be. Then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and the other left. Watch therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. Therefore you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming in an hour you do not expect. Now, I want you to notice a couple of contrasts, and we're going to close with this. I want you to notice a couple of contrasts. In the first part of the discourse, Jesus spoke of specific signs to look for before the coming destruction. When you see armies, do this. Here, there are no specific signs given. He simply says, one day, it's going to happen. Before, when he gave specific signs, here he says, something is going to come upon you unexpectedly, when no one is expecting. Before, he gave very specific time references. He said, all these things are going to come upon this generation. Not 1,000 years from now, upon this generation. But now he's talking about something that no one knows when it's going to happen. Don't know. Don't know the day or the hour. At some point. Before, he talked about unusual events. He talked about earthquakes. He talked about persecutions. Here he says, no, everything's going to be normal. People are going to be eating, drinking, getting married, getting to go to work. That's how it's going to be. So this is my understanding. To close. And I understand that we have left a lot of stuff open. Tons of questions everywhere. Next week we're going to start going through it verse by verse. It may take us 2, 3, 4 weeks. I don't know how long it's going to take us. To close, this is my understanding of the Olivet Discourse. Jesus begins by talking about the events leading up to and prophesies about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And he says all these things are going to come upon this generation. But then he says, but that's not going to be the end of the world. The end of the world is going to be completely different. It's going to be out of the blue at some point when no one is expecting it, and therefore always be prepared for that. So first he prophesies of the destruction of Jerusalem, then he prophesies about the end of the world. So that is my understanding. That is the general structure of the Olivet Discourse. Starting next week, we're going to go through it verse by verse and look at all the details of these prophecies, and we can see if this all fits. Thank you for your attention. Let's pray, and after that we can discuss it.